All right, want to welcome everybody here. This is the first meeting of the subcommittee, K-12 education. And I'd like to also note we have a new legislative analyst, Wendy Kang, right here, who will be covering public ed. Tyler Williams will continue to cover other education and will assist Wendy during this session. We have two presentations. First, you'll hear from Ms. Kang, and then Kent Dickey from the Department of Education will provide a status update on federal relief funds from K through 12. Okay, so first, Ms. Kang, you're up.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members, and I'll provide a brief update on the overview of public education and the governor's proposed amendments. Before we get started, I'll do an update on the K-12 enrollments. And as you'll see on this next slide, the fall 2022 K-12 enrollments increased about 0.7% over last year, which is about 8,200 students. But want to note that this is still below the FY 2019 levels, as you'll see on that graphic. In terms of how this is comparing to projections, you'll see here the average daily membership, and this far bar on the left that you'll see here is the FY 2022 ADMs, and the bill that was passed last session, Chapter 2, is the light gray bars that has a projected increase of about 0.1% and 0.4% for FY 2024, and these have been updated to increase to 0.4% and 0.6%, so about 5,200 and 7,300 students. You'll see there's some technical amendments related to that. We also want to note that this is still lower than the 2020 ADM, the spring 2020 ADM, and based on the meeting that you saw at the fall meeting, these projections are continued to probably stay below the 2020 levels.
I have a question. Has this generally been the trend in most states where you had to fall off like that?
Senator Saslow, most states did see a drop in enrollment from COVID. Now, I don't know if they've rebounded faster or slower than us. That's something we'd have to...
I mean, it's not an emergency, but sometimes you get a chance to check a couple states. See what you
Correct. And you'll remember from the fall annual meeting, even before COVID, we were projected to decrease enrollment at a later 2025, but it kind of accelerated that because of COVID-19 disrupting.
That's mostly because people just aren't having the amount of kids they used to have.
Yes, the demographic shifts and birth trends.
Right. Okay.
And to Tyler's point, Virginia, I think, is not seeing as much of a decline in the birth rates as we have in other states, but Virginia still is feeling an impact, so we'll still continue to see that. Moving on to the proposed pre-K-12 amendments, before we move into what the governor proposed, just want to reflect on what was passed last session. So in Chapter 2, this included an increase of $2.9 billion in general fund for direct aid. And just to highlight a few of the major general fund amendments that were included, there's the $727 million that was for the 5% salary increases in each fiscal year, $800 million in FY23 for school construction grants and modernization funds, $271 million to support increased support positions, and this partially removes the cap. $145 million to increase funding for students placed at risk. $130 million for the used out of federal ARPA funds for a $1,000 bonus, and this was with no local match. $100 million for the College Partnership Lab School Fund, and $62.5 million to provide one reading specialist per 550 students in K through 3. So in terms of the governor's introduced budget, the proposed amendments total $441.9 million in direct aid, and of that, more than half is in technical updates and forecast changes, and I'll provide an overview of those in a minute. And $200.3 million is for policy changes. Okay. So to quickly walk through the technical and forecast changes, you'll see the numbers that are included here on the table. One of the major things to highlight is that the biggest one is the change in the projected sales revenue that's increased, and this is what you'll see is a local offset of the 45 cents on every dollar in terms of what that is a cost savings to the localities. I mentioned earlier there's an update on the average daily membership projections, so that changed the forecast there. Also some updates in the forecast for the remedial summer program and the English language learner. There's a governor's school technical change to be included in the salary increase, and some incentive and categorical lottery funded programs, which also includes just some projected forecast changes as well. Between these two, this is what accounts for that $241 million in over the biennium for technical and technical and forecast changes. Moving on to the summary of the proposed policy changes, we do have some subsequent slides after that describe a few of these, but just as a quick overview of the $200 million that the governor has in proposed policy change amendments. The first one is $50 million in the first year for the College Partnership Lab School Fund, and again, I've got a slide coming up after to talk about that.
$100 million we put up
That is
last?
correct, sir. That's in addition.
Come out.
$5,000 in teacher performance bonuses, and there's a few things related to performance bonuses you'll see here, and we do have a slide to talk a little bit about the details of those. The state share for a 1% retention bonus, a mixed delivery early childhood programs in 2 planning districts, that's in Lenawisco and the Crater region. The expansion of the reading specialist standard to 4th and 5th grades. A targeted $5,000 recruitment bonus, and a math specialist for schools, this is K through 8, with the lowest 10% of SOL math scores. And last, there's a adjustment in the first year for the community and schools.
I had a question.
Senator Hale.
On the $5,000 teacher performance bonuses, was there any description by the governor as to how we select them or what the criteria are, or guidance?
Madam Chair, there is some guidance that is provided on the performance bonuses. One is that it is to be identified by the Department of Education in conjunction with the school divisions, and that the Department of Ed will establish the criteria for awarding the funds based on student academic growth as demonstrated in 2023 SOL assessments through year growth assessments or other appropriate measures determined by the department. So there's some collaboration with local school divisions, mention of using SOL assessments, but also includes other appropriate measures that could be determined by the department. Madam Chair, one other thing to note is the department's criteria shall ensure recognition of teacher performance across the 8 superintendent regions. So there's some interest to make sure it's spread across them. I mentioned we provide a little bit more detail on a few of the ones that we mentioned in the policy amendments. So in terms of the lab school funds, we had the question earlier about the amounts that we provided. So as you may recall, in the last session, there was $100 million approved in the first year. Of that, $5 million in planning grants was set aside for planning grants, $20 million for startup costs, and $75 million to support per pupil costs. And of course, we mentioned earlier the governor's proposed amendments provide an additional $50 million in the first year. We do have a status update on the lab funds so far, and there's actually an update from what's in your packet here and what's on the screen. We had 5 applications that were submitted, and actually we've heard those are 5 that are approved, and that there's 1 additional being that's under review, and then there's 6 additional that have been received. We also have 2 applications in the startup costs, and I believe that those may have been awarded. But I just want to note that next meeting on the 17th, we have the Secretary of Education coming to provide an update, and we also have some individuals from Department of Ed here who may be able to answer more. To provide a little more detail on the salary and bonuses, as we mentioned, there was what's already passed in the budget is the 5% salary increases each year and the $1,000 pandemic bonus. And there's 3 different types of bonuses that are added with the governor's amendments. We just talked a little bit about the performance bonus and the criteria for that. So they're $5,000 awards, and noted that that would be established with the Department of Education. There's a $45 million for a 1% retention bonus for instructional support staff, and then $10 million for a $5,000 hiring incentive payment for individuals filling vacant instruction positions in either hard-to-fill or hard-to-serve schools.
Senator Hale.
I'm sorry. I wonder, staff, if you could research if there's ever been any successful programs such as the governor is proposing on teacher performance. My recollection from years past is there never has been, but there may have been by now.
Certainly we'll look into that, Madam Chair. Last, in the topic of learning loss, of course, there was some actions that were taken last session. We mentioned the establishment of the reading specialists in the K through 3. The governor's proposed amendment is expanding that to have 1 reading specialist for every 550 students and expanding that to 4th and 5th grades. And then also mentioned the math specialists in the select schools, and that's for elementary and middle schools, so K through 8, with spring SOL math scores in the lowest 10% of the state. These are the major areas for direct aid, and want to note a few others that are also included in the budget, as well as some language changes. So a few other to highlight is that in the Secretary of Education, there's a proposal for $438,000 to support 3 FTE positions, and in talking with the Secretary of Education's office, we've heard that 1 is for the early childhood, a position to serve early childhood, 1 is for post-secondary, and 1 is for workforce development. In the Department of Ed, there's additional funding to maintain the automated teacher licensing system, and in the Virginia School for Deaf and Blind is providing funding in the 2nd year to support salary adjustments to help retain teachers and allow them to remain competitive. The last one is some language changes that we want to note. The first is some authorization for temporary flexibility in childcare staff ratios. We assume this is part of the challenges of filling positions, and it allows that the staffing ratios can increase by 1 child for those birth through school age and 2 children for school age to 12. There are requirements that they need to notify teachers, and this would expire in June 30 of 2024. The second one is some language exempting the community-based VPI program from teacher licensure regulations, so long as they meet the state quality measurement and improvement program requirements. And this aligns with some existing flexibility that's already provided with the mixed delivery preschool program. So it's an alignment of language there. One other thing to note is in the other education area, we didn't have any other amendments, so we don't have any updates there. But that concludes the major highlights from the governor's proposed amendments, and be happy to answer any other follow-up questions. If not, I'll turn things over to Kent Dickey with Department of Education. We know that there was a lot of pandemic funds that were authorized over the last few years, and he'll provide an update in terms of the status of those funds.
Welcome, Mr. Dickey.
Mr. Chair.
Did you move that one over?
Just turn Senator Norman's microphone.
Okay. Shannon, turn that off if you want to talk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee, Kent Dickey, DOE, and updating you today on status of the major federal pandemic funding source, the ESSER funds, which you are familiar with, which was the largest tranche of federal pandemic funding in three batches under the 3 federal pandemic laws, and then an update on the EAMS program, the Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools program, which was a much more shorter duration program than the EAMS and GEARS Fund provided under the pandemic laws, and that funding is now reverted for eligible gear uses, which is targeted to governor's use under the federal law. Just a quick overview. As you know, there were 3 separate federal acts providing 3 tranches of the ESSER, the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funds, ESSER 1, 2, and 3. Under those 3 laws, the amount provided by Congress to states was higher with each subsequent law. 90% of the ESSER funding is formula-based to school divisions, to local education agencies based on the state Title I formula. And then 10% of the ESSER funding is available for state set-aside projects and awards and state administration in DOE. An important requirement in the ESSER under ARPA for the ESSER 3 funding was a 20% requirement by school divisions to use their formula funds for learning loss activities and learning recovery, and their spending plans and narratives had to describe that 20% use. Of course, many school divisions locally prioritized greater than 20% for that purpose. School divisions, of course, with all of the ESSER funding, filed applications describing the funding. There was more detail under ESSER 3. School divisions were required with ESSER 3 to collaborate locally and engage the public on spending plans and priorities, and with ESSER 3 had to publicly post those spending plans on their school division websites for public access. Divisions, as you know, the governor directed divisions to update their ESSER 3 spending plans. Those were due at the end of December. We provided some limited extensions, and as of this week, 110 of the revised ESSER 3 spending plans have been submitted, and we're waiting on about 20-some of the school divisions to submit those very, very soon by a January 15th deadline. The EAMS funds, which were targeted at private schools under 2 pots of funding, to support non-public schools in Virginia for their COVID-19 needs, whether that was PPE, social distancing, student mental health, learning loss recovery. Very, very similar allowable uses in the EAMS program as ESSER, but very important distinction in the EAMS program was a very much shorter window on usage than the GEAR and ESSER funds. Limited application window and a limited usage of those 2 batches of funds by private schools under that particular program. As was required with that funding, once the application periods were completed by states and final allocations were set and programs were underway, use of the funds largely completed. States were available to deem the program essentially closed from further application, and the funds were remaining funds were available to be reverted for the governor's emergency education relief GEAR program uses, and that period in Virginia has occurred where program balances for means 1 and 2 has reverted and is available for the GEAR program. One quick note on related to GEAR. While much of the GEAR program spending, and we're focusing the information in the presentation today on ESSER primarily, but one major use of the GEAR 2 funds that was legislatively directed was for needs-based undergraduate financial aid at public institutions, and as of early January, fairly significant balance of that funding is left unreimbursed. We continue to work with the institutions to increase the award and use of those funds, but just wanted to point that particular legislatively directed piece out in GEAR.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question? Kent, could you explain when the GEAR 2 funds have to be expended or obligated for that purpose?
Yeah, the deadline for GEAR 2 is September 30th of 23. I do have that right, Lynn. Yeah. So about a 9-month remaining obligation period for the GEAR 2 funding, quickly approaching. And again, you'll find most of the information in the presentation on the ESSER funding and EANS, and the reimbursement and expenditure update we've provided on the ensuing slides. We ran those numbers as of January 3rd. Of course, in many cases, school divisions have made long-term obligations for their ESSER formula funds, staffing, contracts, facilities renovations related to social distancing, the various uses outlined in their spending plans, and they have clearly planned for the funds, obligated them under contracts or staffing, but have not yet filed for reimbursement with DOE, and they do vary on their reimbursement cycles with DOE, but that's certainly something to keep in mind related to the ESSER funds. Some school divisions do lag in their reimbursement cycles to draw down their funding from the department. And they can draw funds as often as weekly from DOE, and of course for the ESSER 2 funding. This coming September 30th is the obligation deadline, 9 months away. ESSER 3, another year out, September 30th, 2024, about 21 months out remaining for use of the ESSER 3 funds. Just a quick rundown of the total funding awarded to Virginia, ESSER 1, 2, and 3, and for the 90% formula funding. Again, most of the ESSER funding is allocated to school divisions by formula, and you can see the increasing pots of money made available and awarded to LEAs. You see the level of reimbursement. ESSER 1, which we are essentially getting ready to close down. The use of those funds, the obligation deadline was last September 30th. We are essentially closing out final liquidations and reimbursements by the end of this month. And of the $214 million allocated, very, very small balance will remain from those funds. Of course, the much larger pots of ESSER 2 and 3, again, ESSER 2, 9 months remaining in the obligation period, ESSER 3, 21 months. You can see the spend down and the percentage of those funds remaining, of course, much less, but 9 and 20 months remaining in the use periods. The 10% ESSER state set aside, a look at that portion of the funding here. Again, substantially higher for ESSER 2 and 3. You see the level of expense, again, of course, much lower with ESSER 2 and 3 with the longer obligation deadlines. and a very, very small balance with ESSER 1 that we will end up with. That number may even come down just a bit with some final liquidations, but ESSER 1, just less than 1% will remain from the use of those funds.
So we've got almost 1.8 billion left in the balance. Is that correct?
About looks like about 228 million of the state set aside, Mr. Chairman.
That's the state. We're on the page before.
Yeah, on the LEA, yes, sir. That is correct. For the 90% school division LEA formula funds, that is.
And LEA stands for what now?
Local educational agency, the federal parlance for a school district.
Right. Okay.
We'll just call them school divisions.
All right.
But you are correct. About 1.8 billion remaining. And then over a lot of detail on these slides, we were asked to provide a little more detail for ESSER 1, 2, and 3 on the specific state set-aside uses. This is the 10% pot, portion of which is VDOE staffing and administration. You can see a substantial amount in ESSER 1, 2, and 3. And we're showing that on the first line as awarded to school divisions. And we've got a brief parenthetical there showing some of the specific uses that of ESSER 1 that were awarded to school divisions early in the pandemic process. So some of those uses were facilities upgrades, PPE, some of the immediate pandemic response. Falling below that, some of the state level initiatives and state directed projects, the laser data analytics project ongoing in DOE, Virtual Virginia expansion, which grew substantially, DOE's virtual program during the pandemic, and that growth has really been sustained coming out of the pandemic. SOL remote and local growth assessments for when schools were not in person and SOL testing was suspended, development locally on growth assessments that teachers could administer to students remotely to assess them on the SOL standards during the pandemic, and then DOE administration. So again, ESSER 1, we everything spent down on the state level projects except for 207,000. And then again, moving to ESSER 2 and 3, the much larger pots, more usage, more line items of the fund. You'll see some of the state level projects continuing that were originally funded under ESSER 1 continue in ESSER 2. You'll recognize some of these as DOE and governor's initiatives. The newer Bridging the Gap initiative is beginning to, certain components of it are beginning to be funded for the initial development of that initiative. Executive Directive 3 related to teacher shortages, recruitment, and retention. Those are being funded as well. Some of the mandatory requirements, such as the SOL through year growth assessments that are required in the code, have been funded with pandemic funds. That is one example of an ongoing cost that will need general fund support beyond the pandemic funding. But again, awarded funds here, expended, reimbursed, and you see the balances for each of the line items. And then lastly, and again, the biggest state set-aside pot, again, ESSER 3. On that first line, we've isolated the awards to LEAs, to school divisions. Again, some of those continuing from ESSER 1 and 2. And they continue to be funded. Some of those are major initiatives related to learning loss before and after school, funding, and some of those are federal requirements for a minimum amount to be in the state set aside to be allocated for those purposes. But that's a major use of the state set aside. And then again, following that, many of the department mandated services under the code and governor's priorities funded, particularly some of the components of the partnership with Petersburg related to before and after school support, the Urban League mentoring and tutoring, and some of the other, and CIS Virginia, some of those components for the partnership for Petersburg support are supported with ESSER 3.
Senator
What are we
Norman.
doing in Petersburg?
Senator, that's sort of a major comprehensive governor's initiative for various support in Petersburg, mental health, workforce, health, K-12. It's sort of a comprehensive, wraparound of supports and assistance by state agencies targeted
I
at
heard what you
Petersburg.
said last night, but I just was trying to more focused on under the K-12 education budget. What are we trying to do there with 2.5 million?
Yeah, and yes, sir, and that's some of the wraparound services that, targeted at the K-12. The YMCA is standing up before and after school childcare. The Urban League is standing up tutoring and mentoring programs in partnership with some of the HBCUs and going into Petersburg High School. Yes, sir.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah, Steve.
So is the Petersburg YMCA not doing the before and after care because they used to do it?
It's an expansion of current efforts that have been there, and it's the Central Virginia YMCA, the Greater Richmond
Okay.
YMCA. It's coordinated. It's really an expansion, Senator McClellan, of some of the existing services that are being provided to capture additional children.
So you've anticipated my next question. Is it only going to be expanded in Petersburg, or is it going to be expanded in other places where YMCA is providing before and after care?
To date, the funding has just been programmed to focus on Petersburg as part of the partnership for Petersburg. To date, it's had a Petersburg focus only.
Okay, well, Petersburg is not the only place that needs the YMCA to be expanded, but thank you.
And if I might, it's also one of the smaller places. There's only 35,000 people in Petersburg.
Senator Newman, there's only what? Yeah, the whole city. Yeah, oh, I know.
Right? But
We got subdivisions there.
are you confident we're going to get there? In other words, what's missing a little bit here is projected, right? Because after you get to budgeted, expended, and then projected, in other words, if we're not going to make it, in other words, if we're not going to be able to expend the money, then what's the plan to help education, right? And so has the department worked on a projected, and then do we need to think about how we come up with transfer options and reappropriation so that we don't turn money back that could have helped school children, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's one-time money. The obligation periods, are quickly, dwindling down as the weeks and months go by. I mean, it's going to, like school divisions, like with their 90% LEA funds, it's going to take aggressive implementation and standing up of these initiatives. Some of them are well underway. Some of the more one-off projects, have been completed along the way, but some are longer term and some are complex implementation. So it's going to take a push to fulfill these priorities and push hard during the next 21 months.
Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, Mr. Chairman, it just seems like, Janet, we're just going to need to get a lot of updates, and if something's not going to happen, we're going to turn it back in. we need to go from projected, green, yellow, red, and if someone can't perform, we need to, I would think we would need to have flexibility even out of session to transfer or reappropriate. I mean, this thing, I'm kind of shocked by the numbers, honestly, still remaining. I know there's still a lot under, but it just seems like this may take abnormal work on everyone's behalf to make sure that we turn back in the least amount, and we help every child we can, so anyway, it seems like.
Understood.
Yeah.
You mentioned you're going to extend plans, which give an idea.
Yes, and for the for the school division, 90%, which many states have done. States full authority do that. That was focused on the 90%, school division pot. The responsiveness to school divisions late in the year around the holidays was very good. Most of those are in. We're hoping locally from their formula funds that over $1 billion that remains, that will reprioritize and jumpstart school divisions. Same thing has to happen at the state level with these projects. And thanks, Mr. Chairman. The EANS 1 and 2, just a very brief summary here. Again, these were the COVID-19 federal grants, two batches of funding focused on eligible non-public schools. DOE ran those two application processes. It was a much more truncated, limited period of time under the federal guidelines on the obligation and uses of those funds. You see the original award amounts made to Virginia, not like other states nationally. In that last column, substantial amount of funding remains from those original awards, as much as we and as aggressively as we worked with the private school sector for use of those funds, and there were many good uses related to a host of COVID-19 responses and needs, but there are a substantial balance of funds remaining. The first line, the $28 million, is available through this September. 9 months left in that obligation period. The second amount, the $39 million, there available another year, 21 months out, and the directed use of those funds. Again, these fall back under GEAR, which is the governor's pot in each state under the EANS program. Once the balance of funds is reverted, it does revert to GEAR allowable uses. And so the two bullets here outline the planned use of funding, the first use, a series of learning recovery grants that families and students can apply directly for at $3,000 or $1,500 per student. The 3,000 level would be income restricted for lower income students. Other students would be eligible to apply for a $1,500 grant, and with a focus on learning loss, tutoring, other specialized education services and therapies and assistive technology, essentially within those parameters. And then secondly, for the remaining approximate $10 million of funding, a focused learning loss or learning recovery grant application program. Again, like the original iteration of the EANS private school program, a grant offering targeted at low-income non-public schools that were eligible under the original EANS 2. So two planned uses of the reverted EANS private school funds that are now allowable under the GEAR federal guidelines.
ask a question
Sure.
here? Ken, I know the Eanes one on this slide says it has to be obligated by or used through September 30th of 2023, 9 months from now. Is there a second contingency plan if you can't spend the 28 million for the money to the students and parents for learning loss and tutoring?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the funds have to be obligated. They've got to be, contractually planned to be used. Don't have to be fully spent or liquidated. We would essentially have another 4-month period through January of 24 in running this student learning recovery grant program to Virginia K-12 students. As long as the awards are made to families, to students, we would, by September 30th, the services could ensue past September 30th for reimbursement of the program providers through January of 24. So there's that liquidation safety valve, but the funds would have to be awarded by September 30th. Don't have to be fully spent yet, just awarded.
Is that true of all the funds? In other words, is every fund expended versus appropriated, or does that follow through? Does everyone have a deadline of appropriated?
Just
and a
about.
future deadline for expended?
Yep. Yes, sir. Yeah, and that's essentially just federally directed. The September 30th end date for obligation in the eyes of the federal government, a grant, a contract, some binding commitment by September 30th, 23 or 24, but then there's the 4-month liquidation period that's allowable, potentially even longer under, a request to the federal government to even go longer if the funds are actively being spent out in the program being completed. There's even a provision for a longer spend down and final liquidation period.
Question.
Yeah.
Sorry. So these grants, are they directly to parents? Are they to school divisions? How are they going to be distributed?
Yeah, we're in an RFP right now, in a procurement to identify a managed service vendor to help administer these grants. Gear funds are not permitted to be paid to an individual directly, to a parent, to a student, to no individual. They can be allocated on behalf of a parent or student. Payment managed service systems that are out there in the industry to administer these types of decentralized grant programs are designed to essentially allocate a funding allocation to a particular parent or student. They never would have direct access to the funds. They can direct the funds to a service provider for a service, but the concept here would be to run an application process, parents, families, students, through an application portal, according to the state criteria, allocate those funds for allowable services, set aside or earmark or allocate a per student amount for a successful applicant, and then they seek a qualified service provider for tutoring, for physical therapy, for assistive technology purchases, their desired purchase with their grant allocation, and then the centralized systems designed to route the grant funding for qualifying payments to a provider. But at no time would the actual funding be sent to a parent or student.
But follow up, Mr. Chair. So, and I don't know if this is in your RFP for who would administer this program, but who will determine eligibility? It sounds like the parents or the student would apply for the grant. How are you all figuring out how parents and students will find out about eligibility. And let me tell you why I'm asking. Is there are a lot of school divisions and there's parents who are very plugged in and probably would immediately figure out this is available, and then there are parents that are not, and the parents that are not are probably the ones whose kids need it the most. So what are you all doing to make sure that the parents who would not likely find this on their own are going to know about it?
You're exactly right. I mean, that's the vendor's going to be sort of the third-party administrator. It's really going to be DOE's job,
Okay.
the administration's job to get the word out. And that is critical, and that's part of our deployment. The outreach, the communications is critical for this. We need to reach out as much as we can statewide to as many constituencies, all corners of the state. We've begun to talk about that, including with governor's office, including with the secretary's office, really a multifaceted, communications, promotional effort to get the word out on this when it's ready for launch.
Can I ask one more question? And so who will determine, will it be the Board of Education, the Department of Ed, the vendor? Who will determine what the eligibility criteria are?
Yeah, the DOE, the state will set the eligibility criteria, and that will be part of the scope of work and the task for the vendor to work within those guidelines, enforce those guidelines under supervision and oversight by DOE. But the higher grant amount proposed at $3,000 is targeted at students with a household income of not above 300% of the federal poverty level. The lower grant amount of $1,500 is targeted any Virginia K-12 school age student.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lastly, Mr. Chair, just a reminder of the Chapter 2 reporting requirement that went into the Chapter 2 budget last spring, monitoring the school division use of the ESSER funds. We've begun to, of course, meet internally on executing that data collection. We've met with Tyler and House Appropriations staff on approach and strategy to capture this data, but we will need to finish executing this data collection as soon as possible. We're focusing in on the ESSER 2 and 3 school division formula funds, essentially get school divisions reporting and affirming the funds they have firmly obligated and committed, and for those that they have not, a timeline to firmly plan and obligate those funds for usage. And of course, we're hoping the update of the ESSER 3 spending plans that we just about finished collecting from school divisions will help solidify some of those planned uses of the largest pot from ESSER 3, and that data, as we hopefully complete the submissions in the next week, we can make that information available that we collected from school divisions available to the subcommittee. That would leave getting information on ESSER 2, so DOE will likely follow with a scaled down data collection to check spending plans and obligations for ESSER 2, and we can include any other information for school divisions to submit on ESSER 3 as well. But what's coming in now on ESSER 3 on their updated spending plans, which are quite granular with budgets, may fulfill this requirement for the ESSER 3 portion. But thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Any questions? Anybody? Well, I think that pretty much does it for this meeting. Okay, subcommittee will rise.